Welcome to episode 132 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, so the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/132.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey all, thanks for joining me for another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm still working on a new solo episode and have been rather time poor lately. So you're going to have to be patient on that front, or if you actually prefer the guest episodes, then you don't have to be patient at all because that was what we've got on for today. So today's show is me chatting with Tabitha Farrar. So Tabitha grew up in Wiltshire, England, and despite being a robust and confident teenager, she developed an eating disorder at age 17, and this devastating illness took pole position in her life until at age 25, she finally started her recovery journey. And she successfully recovered from anorexia nervosa and the complicated matrix of obsessions and habitual eating disorder behaviours that came with it. And since then, she's done so much in the recovery world. She's a founding member of International Eating Disorder Action. She's written 2 books. She's the host of the Eating Disorder Recovery podcast, and she also coaches adults in recovery. And I've been aware of Tabitha's work for a number of years and have listened to many of her podcasts. And more recently, her name kept coming up more and more. And probably for the last couple of times, probably 2-3 times that I've done client intakes, when I speak to clients about who they follow and who has helped them in recovery so far, there are 2 names that are mentioned more than anyone else. And one of them is Merritt Boxler and her podcast, Life Unrestricted. And then the other is Tabitha Farrar. And earlier this year, Tabitha released her second book called Rehabilitate, Rewire, Recover. And again, I had a number of clients mention it. So recently I read it and I really enjoyed it. I think Tabitha and I share a lot of things in common in how we think about recovery. And so having a resource like her book that does go through things in such detail, but is also accessible and easy to read, has been really helpful. So after following her from afar for the last couple of years, I finally decided to get in contact and asked her on the show. So as part of the episode, we talk about her experience of dealing with anorexia and the recovery process, and many of the aspects of Tabitha's experience are atypical. So it was good to be able to go through this and show how some of the assumptions or the stereotypes that we have about eating disorders aren't always true. And then we use her book, the most recent book, as the basis for the rest of the conversation. So we go through the migration theory for anorexia, through the concepts of nutritional rehabilitation and neural rewiring. We can look at energy debt and various symptoms of malnutrition and different types of restriction and lots more. And Tabitha, by her own admission, is blunt and has a lot to say on the topic of eating disorders, but I'm very grateful for what we got to cover and her insights around recovery. So let's get on with the show. Here is my conversation with Tabitha Farrar. Hey Tabitha, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to be chatting with you.
Yeah, me too, Chris.
So, look, anorexia recovery is basically what I want to chat about today, and there's 2 parts to this. So, firstly, there's your story and experience with anorexia and recovery, and then secondly, there's the most recent book that you've written, which is Rehabilitate, Rewire, Recover, which I've read and I loved, and that looks at recovery both more broadly and also in more detail. So, that's the general idea for today's chat. But I guess as a starting place, for any listener who doesn't know who you are, do you want to give a bit of background on yourself? And we're going to go into more detail on this stuff, but like just starting with who you are and what you do.
Yeah, my name is Tabitha Farrar. I am a Brit, but I live in Colorado, and I work as an eating disorder recovery coach, which is a bit of a strange thing, and I'm not sure that it was actually a thing when I started working as an eating disorder recovery coach. I began by recovering myself, which I did without any professional treatment, which is I just want to put in there. It's not something I necessarily advise. It was just what happened in my situation. And I began writing about it. And then people began following my blog. And then people began emailing me and asking me lots of questions and asking me if I could coach them. And I started doing that. I was working in marketing at the time, had a full-time job. And then really the demand for it got so much that I quit my full-time job. And now I'm a full-time coach. So it just sort of happened by accident.
Right. So let's then start with your side of the story. So you suffer with anorexia, and I know your story is probably atypical or atypical at least in terms of the narrative that people hear in terms of how it started. So do you want to describe this?
Yes, I never had any body image issues, actually. I was an anomaly in that I was a really body confident teenager. I just never had, I didn't really have any negative self-talk about my body. And I always found it slightly strange how my friends were always kind of just, I used to think of it as slagging their bodies off. I just found that strange. It was, and I remember that often as a teenager, just thinking, what's your body like? Why are you so mean to it? Which I know is not normal for a teenage girl, but that was me. And that's also one of the reasons that I was somebody that nobody thought would develop an eating disorder, and I did. So I think I like to talk about that because I think it sort of helps get rid of that stereotype a little bit, that it's only people who are having a lot of negative body image problems that develop eating disorders. Yeah. And I did go on a diet, though. But my reasoning for going on the diet was because I was working in a racing yard at the time as a jockey, an exercise jockey, because I'm too tall. So, and actually, racing is not the industry I was in. I used to ride event horses, but I was just earning money. It was just to earn money. I would exercise some of the race horses at a local yard, and I fell in love with this little horse called Kit Kat. She was this little chestnut filly, and she was very small, though, and I wasn't ever getting the rides on her. And then I worked out it was because the trainer had figured that I was just a little bit too heavy for her. And that was my motivation for losing a bit of weight. And I really didn't want to lose much at all. I wanted to lose, 5 pounds or something. And it worked. I got to ride Kit Kat because my weight dropped. But then it didn't go as I expected, in that I then couldn't get myself eating again. And it was just, as many people who have anorexia or restrictive eating disorder will know, it just happens so naturally. It's just like, it feels kind of good not to eat. And everybody's complimenting me for losing a bit of weight. So this must be a good thing. I should keep on doing this. And then I started to want to exercise more. And it just felt, again, like a natural thing. I just feel good when I exercise. And everybody tells me exercise is good for me. And everybody's saying that it's a good thing that I've got a gym membership and that I'm going. And then it starts to snowball. And then people start telling you it's not a good thing. But at that point, you can't do much about it, or at least I couldn't. I was way too far gone. I lost weight very quickly. And then I had that very severe anorexia for around 10 years.
And so with the losing weight quickly, was that also atypical in comparison to what is the norm?
I don't think that there's necessarily a norm. I think that all people's bodies lose weight differently, and mine reacted to the reduction in calories, the reduction of food intake, and the increase in exercise. I did lose weight pretty quickly, but I don't think that you necessarily have to lose a lot of weight to have anorexia. I know lots of people who don't even lose enough weight to, say, fall into the underweight category in the BMI chart, but they have very active anorexia. And so that's just the way my body reacted. And my whole family are a relatively like string bean family of body types anyway. So as I'm tall as well, so it was very obvious on me, and it looked bad very quickly.
And so how quickly did you go from, you know what, I really want to ride this racehorse, I'm going to go on a diet, to being in the depths or being in a place that would get you categorized as having anorexia?
Well, it was the middle of the summer. That's when I had the racing job. I can't remember exactly when, but I know it was the middle of the summer. That's when I had that job. And I would imagine it was around June, July sort of time. And it was by the time I was going away to university for the first time that fall. And I guess I went away in September sort of time. And I do remember that about a month before I was due to go to university, my mother started to get worried about me. Most people were still in the category of, oh, you look great, and it's great that you're enjoying exercise and these things. But I know my mum was getting worried. And just before the week before I was due to go away, she really tried to get me not to go. I think she'd already clicked that there was something very much not right, and I had lost far too much weight, and just not even the weight, but just my behavior changed. I used to be somebody who ate everything and anything, and now I am somebody who eats everything and anything. So I think it was majorly concerning to her was just seeing me decline biscuits with my tea, just seeing all these little things that were not me. Really alerted her that something was wrong. But I wanted to go to uni, so I went, even though she asked me not to. And about midterm, when I went, that middle of that first term, a friend came up to visit with me. She stayed for 3 days, and she went straight home after staying with me for 3 days and just drove straight from the train station to my parents' house, and then dissolved in tears at my parents' house, just saying, like, because I look so awful. And so I think my parents were then set up for, by the time I came home at Christmas, what they were going to get. And by the time that I came home at Christmas, it was really entrenched, because I'd had that whole term just to exercise and not eat and get into all of these behavioural patterns.
And so can you then describe and maybe give a bit of a potted history of the 10 years, and I know I'm asking you to do a lot there, but the 10 years of the disorder and how it progressed, and then also kind of how you started to then come out of that?
Right. So I had a very strong OCD component to my eating disorder. That's true for many of us who have the exercise compulsion. And I think genetically, according to the work that people like Cynthia Buick have done, genetically OCD and anorexia lie close together. So some people, not everybody, have a strong OCD component to their eating disorders. And I was really on the really strong side. And the exercise thing, I joined a gym in the first term, I think it was. I can't quite remember. It might have been a bit later. But I know that I had been someone who had never went to the gym apart from in PE when we were made to at school. And then I started to just enjoy working out, and then become very, very quickly very obsessive about working out, particularly running. I started running, and I can't really ever say I've ever, if I'm honest, enjoyed running. I hate it. But it was just that compulsion, I have to do this. And it was very quickly that movement and food became linked in my brain. So it was really fast that if I was going to eat that day, I had to have done a lot of exercise. I still starkly remember at University Digs going to the canteen at breakfast time, and I was on my own because the rest of my digs had all slept in. I was always an early riser, and I'd always been somebody that eats breakfast. And I remember the first time I got myself something like a banana or like yo fat log, just tiny little breakfast. And I remember looking at it and thinking, this is all I'm going to eat today. And it's just that sort of thing started to kick in, that sort of challenge, and that challenge making me feel good. And so I very quickly got into those sorts of habits, which most of them stuck with me throughout that 10 years. But everything shifts and changed. And so not many people with anorexia can strictly restrict for a prolonged period of time. Most of us can only do it for 6 to 8 months. And that's when the exercise starts to come in, because you can't continue to strictly restrict. And so in order to justify eating, the exercise starts to creep in. So the exercise really for me was a form of purging. And then after that, the exercise just turned into its own thing, which it really was just like a compulsion. This is what I do every day. This is what I do when I wake up. And then the OCD started to filter into everything else as well. So just my daily routines, I was absolutely rigid, even the way that I made a cup of tea. I mean, not necessarily what I put in a cup of tea, but the way I made it, the amount of times I walked across the kitchen to get a glass, to get a mug, to get the milk, that was routine. And so many of these things were so small that an onlooker wouldn't necessarily notice unless they were very close to me. But I knew it caused me distress to say, make my cup of tea in a different order. Now, I'm not somebody who has OCD other than when I have anorexia. I didn't have any OCD before. And so many of these behavioral traits started to come out in me just as a result of my brain and body being in malnutrition. And what happens then is that many of these things begin to come entrenched and the brain starts to learn because, say, for example, with that cup of tea, something which is very non-threatening. I could make a cup of tea. I knew logically I could make a cup of tea differently and it wouldn't be a threat to me. But my survival brain just didn't seem to know that. And I think that when you do something repetitively, then your brain starts to think, well, I obviously have to do this way because I always do this way. So this is obviously the safe way to do this. And it's obviously unsafe to do it any other way just because I don't do it any other way. And so this completely illogical HBA axis kind of fight or flight response would come up in me, even about changing the tiniest thing, like the thought of I'm going to go and get the milk first before I go and get the tea bag, which part of me knew was completely illogical. But fear is fear. And most of us tend to run away from fear rather than challenge it. And so I would just do the same thing every day and filter out any friends, filter out any influences that might make me have to be flexible. And so then you get very lonely, which gives you much more time to be inflexible, rigid, and OCD, because I would fill that time that I should have been probably spending with friends or doing leisure activities or socializing, I'd fill it with exercise and other routines. And so that was really my life for many years. And it would shift from time to time. Obviously, when I left uni, moving environments, different jobs, different things would cause shifts. But the general theme was the same, and the exercise always being a huge component of it. I never would admit to myself or anybody else that I had an eating disorder. I didn't believe I was the type of person that could, because I thought that eating disorders happened to vain teenage girls and people who are obsessed with their bodies. And I was never any of those things. And so I think that really got many of my doctors and GPs as well. I just think it baffled many people that I had an eating disorder. I also swore blind that I didn't, so that didn't help. But I remember doctors sort of trying to pry into my family life and see if there'd been any abuse there, because many doctors at that time also thought, well, eating disorders are a product of poor parenting and problems like that. And that none of the reasons why people get eating disorders apparently fit me. Which really, I think really even from when I started to come to my awareness that I had an eating disorder, I knew that it was something biological happening to me. It wasn't something I'd chosen. I didn't want to be that way. I didn't even like running. It felt very biological, like I have to do this, no choice in there. And so, long story short, around the age of 26, I was suicidal, because it's very depressing living like that. It's tiring as well. It's exhausting. The thoughts don't end. I didn't sleep, because what I discovered, that when my body's in malnutrition and thinks it needs food all the time, because it does need food all the time, it prioritizes food over sleep. And so I had horrible insomnia. And so the days were never ending. My thoughts were relentless, looping thoughts, obsessing about food, obsessing about exercise, that mental hunger. And I really was, I'm going to change or I'm going to kill myself. And I was serious about that. And so that's really what pushed me to change, which, again, I don't necessarily recommend. I'm just telling the truth, how it worked out for me. I'm not saying that my story is ideal by any means. And I kind of like dabbled. I think my recovery process was around 4 years, to be honest. Like, I tried different things. I failed more than I didn't fail. One of the standout things for me was when I decided to go cold turkey on the exercise, and I just stopped. And it was the hardest thing. It was absolutely the hardest thing I've ever done. It's the hardest decision I've ever made in my life. My brain was so fearful of stopping movement.
And where was that in the 4 years?
Oh, that was towards the end.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was really, that was one of the things that I would say, actually, I think that moment kickstarted my recovery. Because I don't believe you can recover from restrictive eating disorder and have compulsive exercise and still compulsively exercise. You can gain weight. That's not the same as recovery. For me, I needed to stop the exercise. I see exercise, for those of us who have the exercise component of anorexia, it's like this big energy source for the eating disorder. It like fires up and provides energy to all of those neural pathways that the eating disorder has created. And so I think it's very difficult to, say, for example, change what you're eating when you're exercising each day and you are completely in that eating disorder neural network. The first morning that I woke up and didn't go for a run, I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience, but it was like my brain didn't have a set for that day, because I always got up and ran. And then I'd have my very disordered breakfast afterwards. And because I hadn't got up and run, it was like my brain was on a completely different neural track. It just completely shifted it off. And I actually found that I was able to start changing the foods that I was eating much easier, because I wasn't in this neural rut, which says, after you run, you eat X, Y, Z. It was like, you haven't been for a run, so what the hell are we doing? And I was able to take advantage of that and say, we're doing this, which is completely different. But hey, I was riding that energy, which was sure kind of adrenaline energy, to push myself to start to change. And so recovery really went from there. And it was still messy. I still made slips and slides, but it really, that year was immense change. And what I discovered in that year, because something I always told people was, because I hated being underweight. I really did. I looked awful. And I didn't have body dysmorphia. I could see it. I looked horrific. Didn't stop me being scared of gaining weight, which is another illogical and rather kind of strange, weird, and wonderful thing about anorexia. You can be very underweight, want to gain weight, and still be terrified of gaining weight. But I would always tell people, oh, yeah, I know I'm really skinny. I'm trying to gain weight for 10 plus years. And what I really discovered was that it was, when I put my mind to it, I could gain weight, no problem. And I think that's one of the things that scared me, is that I knew that if I really wanted to gain weight and I did it, I could. And I did. And with the nutritional rehabilitation, my brain started to turn off that anorexia response, which I believe is a migration response. When your brain thinks that food is scarce, it wants to move a lot and eat very little, because that's what migrating animals do. And as that started to switch off, all of those traits, they didn't go away, but they got weaker. And then with determination, I was able to break them, because the nutritional rehabilitation had helped me weaken the strength of those kind of like, I have to do these things, especially the movement and the restrictive eating. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And some of those things that you touched on in terms of the migration, in terms of nutritional rehabilitation, the neural rewiring, are things that I want to go into in more detail, because they come up in the book, and I think they're incredibly important. I mean, you said earlier that you did all of this on your own. You didn't really go through any traditional treatment. I mean,
no.
Were you kind of pushed in that direction? I mean, you mentioned your mom was terrified after just 3 months of it. So I imagine over a 10-year period is going to be also kind of pushing you in that. I don't
know. I mean, I stopped going to the doctor, so there wasn't really anyone to push me, and I was so reactive. Both my parents know that even if they mentioned the words eating disorder, I was out the door. And because I was an adult, there was nothing they could do to stop me. I had a car. I had my own place. So there wasn't really anyone to push me. And I guess that most people who would have just got their head bitten off too many times to keep trying. So I don't know that I was ever necessarily pushed in that direction after the initial couple of GPs who tried to psychoanalyze me. But what I did know is I just knew it wouldn't help me. Because I knew I had no trauma. I had no trauma. I knew that there was just nothing that I feel like, or what I felt was, if I went into a psychotherapist's office and they were asking me, like, why are you doing this to yourself? I felt like I'd be making stuff up to please them. And I figured that, if I couldn't work out why I was doing this to myself, then I wasn't doing it to myself in that sense. And it didn't feel like that to me. Like I said, it felt biological. I don't know how I knew that, but that's what it felt like. It felt like it was something biological in me that was pushing me to be this way, not something that was some deep, dark, repressed psychological reason. And I think it's just my personality type as well. I just don't think that, I think I'm too argumentative. I just don't think it would have worked. I think I would have been, so that also may have been, a lot of that may have been my stereotypical at that time view of what a therapist does.
Yeah.
And I didn't know any other way. I didn't know any other way. And I think I'm definitely one of these people. And again, I'm not advocating for this. I think everyone should absolutely seek help to recover from an eating disorder. And I think I should have as well. But I'm just a stubborn idiot a lot of the time who has to do everything herself, even if that means it's going to take 10 years rather than 1 year.
Yeah.
And that's what happened.
And so were there, even though you weren't going down that traditional route, were there resources that you found that then really helped you?
Nothing that was helpful in terms of therapy, and I can't really say that I ever looked for anything. The resource that I found that really helped me at that time, which was, and this must have been, I remember for most of my eating disorder, the internet wasn't really a thing. So, but it was towards that time when I was actually like, okay, I have an eating disorder, and holy crap, I need to work out how to deal with this. I came across the Feast website, which is a website aimed at parents of children with eating disorders. It's a family-based treatment website. It's teaching people how to refeed their child. And the stuff on there was really helpful to me. Because the parents were basically describing my reaction to food when they were talking about how the tantrums their children were having. And it also was really focused on nutritional rehabilitation more than anything else, which is if you get nutrition into this child, they will start to get better and their brain will start to come back. And something, again, I don't really know why, for some reason it clicked with me. I was like, I have to force feed myself. I say it like that as if it was easy. It wasn't. It was traumatic. That was traumatic, force feeding myself. There were many meals that I sat through blubbing and sobbing and crying and shaking, but I was actually able to use that stubborn idiot to my advantage in those sorts of situations. And just in the same way, if I looked at something in the morning and said, I'm not eating anything else all day, I could do that. If I looked at a plate of food that terrified me and said, I'm not leaving this table until it's all eaten, I could do that too. And I did start doing that.
So really channeling the thing that got you into it to be the thing that gets you out of it.
I'm very competitive with myself. So it's like, and another key thing for me, which again sounds like it should be obvious, but it really wasn't for me for many years. Another key thing for me was being able to identify my tantrum around food and my resistance to eating and my resistance to not exercising as fear. And as soon as I was able to understand, oh, I'm scared of that lasagna, rather than sort of all the things I've been telling myself, well, like I just don't like meat, or I don't eat dairy, or I don't eat gluten, or I don't like the fact that someone's trying to make me eat it, and I don't like people telling me what to do. These are all the reasons I don't want to eat that lasagna. When I could be truthful and identify, I don't want to eat that lasagna because I'm scared of it, then something clicked with me, because I hate being scared of anything. And so then I was like, I'm going to damn well eat that lasagna just to prove to myself that I can.
And did that level of truthfulness happen like early on, or there needed to be some level of nutritional rehabilitation before you could get to that place?
I think I sort of stumbled myself up. What I did is, as I stopped exercising, that was hard. And then I stumbled myself up to somewhere that people might say was within the healthy BMI range, but was still underweight for me. But that is some degree of nutritional rehabilitation. And that was actually only after I got myself up there that I started to begin to understand the concept of unrestricted eating, and that I needed to do that. So I definitely had to get some nutritional rehabilitation before my brain was open enough to, I'm going to go out there and eat the scariest things that I can find, because those are the things that I really want. Okay.
And you talked earlier about you becoming a recovery coach, and it sounded like that happens almost organically or even haphazardly. If you hadn't been pulled back into that by the people, do you think you would be wanting? Had there been thoughts of maybe I want to go back and help people, or maybe I want to stay in this field, or when you got into your marketing, you were like thinking, I'm going to make a clean break and I'm going to do something else?
I think early on in the first couple of years of my moving towards full recovery, I absolutely needed a break from absolutely everything. It was years later that I started to probably write my blog a bit more and get more involved with advocacy. So I certainly needed that break. And I don't think at that time I considered I would go back into, or I would go into being or doing anything to do with eating disorders. I was quite happy with marketing, but now I'm really glad that I did change that. Honestly, the one thing that I wanted to be all my life was a vet. And that really changed with anorexia. Definitely took that away from me. I was so obsessed with the gym, I didn't really care what I did. I sort of staggered through university, mostly using university as an excuse to stay away from my parents so that they couldn't try and stop me exercising. And then as soon as I got out of university, I wasn't at all interested in further education. I just wanted to move into my own place and go more into the exercise industry. And so there wasn't much hope. I felt like it was too late for me to go back and do all of the reschooling I'd need to do in order to be a vet. So I think that if, my first choice career would definitely be I would want to be a vet, but that's not going to happen. So eating disorder recovery coach is what we've got.
Okay. So with your book, so Rehabilitate, Rewire, Recover, when did this actually come out? Am I right in thinking it was this year, or am I really behind the curve on this?
Yeah, this year. It was this year.
Okay, cool.
I think it was April. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've read the book fairly recently. I really love it. It's very comprehensive and touches on so many aspects of recovery and physiology and goes through all the multitude of different symptoms that occur. But despite that, it's also quite an easy read. So as a practitioner, I find it helpful, but it's also a book that's useful for me to recommend to clients if they haven't read it all already. So I guess when you were writing it, like, what was the intended audience?
Definitely intended audience is adults in recovery from eating disorders. So really myself at that time is the intended audience. And when I'm talking about eating disorders, and especially when I'm talking to adults who are in recovery, pretty much the only tone that I have is a very blunt one. I talk to people the way I needed someone to talk to me. So the tone of the book is again, pretty straightforward and to the point.
Yes. And I guess, like, with that, how would you characterize the book as being different to other things that are within the recovery space? Like, is it just the bluntness, or what other things do you think you're offering that's different?
There's very little in the way of therapy, or even actually nutritional education in the book. And that's actually one of my stances. I think that people with restrictive eating disorders are already hyper aware around food and nutrition and all things. That's the last thing they need more education on. And I have some kind of very different views on recovery processes than I think is the traditional route. One of those being the migration response. That anorexia is a migration response. I'd say that's pretty different. It's actually, I think, a much more scientific view. If you look at migrating animals, what happens is they go into energy deficit. The food reduces in their environment, and then something in them triggers this response to move a lot and not eat while they're moving until they get to the place that they're migrating to, and then they stop moving and they eat. It's not like a bird sits there and just decides, I fancy a vacation or a holiday in Australia. Something genetic something in its biology is prompting this desire to move. And when animals are migrating, they can't stop and eat very much. That's actually a threat to their survival, is to try and find food in the area that they're migrating from, because food is scarce there, and they'll spend a lot of energy moving around looking for food, when really they just need to use that energy getting the hell out of there. And I think that really why that theory hit me so hard was the movement thing. Movement felt so crucial to my survival when I had an eating disorder in a way that I couldn't logically explain. It had to be something biological. So I think that's hugely different. And then riding off the back of that, which is very controversial in this field, is that I think that binge eating, or feast eating as I call it, is entirely appropriate when somebody is recovering from a restrictive eating disorder and is in malnutrition. And for many of us, admit it or not, lots of people don't like to admit it, the desire to eat a lot of food when you're in recovery is absolutely huge. And so I think that that's, as I said, entirely appropriate. And that's what migrating animals do when they get to the place that they're migrating, is they feast. They eat a lot to make up for the deficit. And one of my biggest issues with the eating disorder industry is treatment centers, treatment professionals that tell people that if they want an extra bag of crisps or whatever, somebody that's been brave enough to admit that and say that, telling them that that's too much and that that's a binge. I think you can do way more damage to a person by saying that, somebody who's in recovery, than anything else.
Yeah. And both of those are things that I really enjoyed about the book. I mean, with the migration theory, is this something you go through with clients? And if so, does it help? Because, I mean, when I read that, I feel like it's a really nice level detachment and just helps people see through their thoughts and behaviors as part of that response, as opposed to, I don't know, who they are. Yes,
certainly. It's everything in that book is a big way that I recovery coach as well, which is, oh, yeah, you're scared of highly caloric foods because your brain is scared of these foods because your brain thinks you need to migrate. And highly caloric foods would be the ones that you would have to stop and hunt for, because that would be meat when we were back migrating years. So, of course, your brain is really scared of that. But we need to teach your brain not to be scared of that by eating the highly caloric food. And I think that when people, because the fear response is so strong, most people, when they can understand, like, oh, this is a biological reaction, of course it doesn't seem logical, then that really actually helps them understand that it's not to do with anything. It's just this biological reaction that we have to amend by gaining weight, not suppressing body weight, and rewiring the brain. And then I think that they can become quite task orientated, like take the emotion out and just be like, oh, I'm having a fear reaction. I have to sort that out by going towards the thing I'm scared of, rather than running away from it.
Yeah. And I do. I mean, fear is something that just runs through the book, and you bring it up again and again because it comes up again and again, and pretty much everything that has to be overcome or has to be dealt with, fear is going to be a part of that.
Yes. And the real kicker with anorexia is that it does trigger our fear response. And the fear response is so strong, and it's so strong for a reason in humans. It's strong because it needs to be to keep us safe. And so you're really dealing with something pretty huge when you're trying to rewire a fear response. You have to be incredibly consistent, and you have to be incredibly determined and knowing that you're doing the right thing. And I think that that's often a missing link for people, are having this fear response, and sort of a part of them knows, like, I really should push myself to eat more cake if I'm scared of eating more cake, and I kind of want to do it anyway. I really want to eat more cake. Like, there's a part of people that know what the right answer is, but then there's a lot of confusion that gets put on top of that when you hear sort of stories of, oh, but somebody once told me that eating more of that would be binge eating disorder. And it all piles on top, and it adds to the fear rather than adding to the person's recovery. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think when we're dealing with this strong a fear response, all of the energy that we're using to help people in recovery has to be the, you can do this. Not that, oh, you should be a bit careful, though.
Yeah. And look, the book, I mean, you touched on it already, but the book can roughly be broken into two parts that are worked on concurrently. So there's the nutritional rehabilitation, and then you've got the neural rewiring or the brain rewiring. Mm-hmm. And I want to go through these in a bit of detail, but do you want to just give an explanation about what both of those are and mean?
So nutritional rehabilitation, you can't recover without that, because it's the energy deficit or lack of nutrition that triggers the brain to think, oh, heck, I must be in a famine, because why else would there not be enough food? And this is brainstem area. I'm not talking like logical brain. This is brainstem area that just reacts and keeps us safe. And famine would have been one of the biggest threats to humans, not now, but years when our brains were developing. And so that's what we call the reptile brain, and we call it the reptile brain for a reason, because it's the oldest part of the brain. And so in those of us who have the anorexia genetics, you go into energy deficit and this reptile brain kicks off, and it's like, right, you have to migrate. And then that usually has this cascading behavioral things that start to happen to us. And so without nutritional rehabilitation, if you imagine that's a switch that turns on, gone into energy deficit enough, therefore we need to move. We need to get that switch turned off. And the only way that's going to happen is if you get out of energy deficit. A lot for the majority of us, that means committing to weight gain. And so the nutritional rehabilitation is, that's not a option, has to happen if you want to recover. But the neural rewiring is also has to happen, because especially if you've had an eating disorder for anything longer than 20 minutes, your brain's going to start forming neural pathways of these repeated behaviors. And over years and years and years, like it had for me, these neural pathways cease to need to have a reason. They're just what you do. And if you stop doing or change doing what it is you do, your brain elicits this fear response. Because when your body's in malnutrition, your brain is going to come to the conclusion that you must be in this hostile environment. Something's really not right. And I think that when our brains are in that kind of survival instinct mode, they form habitual behavior a lot quicker. And so this habitual behavior that many of us get and all these compulsions can be really strong. But it's all tied up to one another. And so if you just do the nutritional rehabilitation, which is what happens a lot of the time, you go to a treatment center and you're just fed, and that's brilliant, and that's great, you need to gain weight. But if it's done without neural rewiring, the neural network is still there. So you still behave the same way, and as soon as you leave that treatment center, you just snap back to that way of operating. Of course, you're going to relapse, going to go backwards. So and also what happens a lot is what many people find is that they're just as eating disordered. They still have anorexia. They're just in a larger body. Being in a larger body is great, but it's not full recovery. And so full recovery is not having anorexia. And in order to get there, which I believe absolutely anybody who sets their mind to it can do, you have to understand the neural rewiring piece as well. And you have to train your brain that it's safe to eat all of these foods, and you have to train your brain that it's safe not to do all of these routines. And that's what causes the brain to really start relaxing, come out of thinking that food is scarce. Because another part of this is the food scarcity bit, right? If your brain thinks that food is scarce, and it's acting a certain way because it thinks food is scarce, then even if your weight goes up, if you're still acting like food is scarce, eating in a really restricted way, exercising quite a lot, if you're still doing all of the things that you did when food is scarce, then your brain is going to continue to think that despite the fact that your weight went up, there's still something not right. Because why would you not be doing all those things? Why would you be doing all those things if food was no longer scarce? And so I see recovery as a lot of it is, and this is both neural rewiring and nutritional rehabilitation, is that we have to convince the brain that food is not scarce, both in our actions, that's eating the food, responding to hunger as if there's no food scarcity, and all of our behaviors, and even our thought patterns. So you need to rewire even thought patterns that say to you, I can only eat so much of that. Because it's not true. You can eat as much of it as you want. And you can't keep giving your brain the message that food is scarce, which is exactly what you do when you place a limit on the amount of food you can eat. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And with the energy deficit part of it, you give a really great analogy using money to illustrate the depths that someone can find themselves in after a decade of restriction. Mm-hmm. And it really shows why nutritional rehabilitation takes so long, and also why it can take a lot more food than what people originally think it's going to take. And I don't know if you remember the example to share it, but I think it's really helpful for people to get.
And also why nutritional rehabilitation does not stop when the magic BMI 19 is reached, or whatever it is, or when a target rate is reached, which is nonsense, the idea of a target weight being set by anybody other than the person's body, but that's another topic. So the money analogy is that I talk about something called energy debt, which is like it's the accumulation of prolonged energy deficits. But the money example is, you can say, if you've got a job, you've got a great house, and then you get laid off your job, and you don't have a job for a number of years. And so you just you cut all of your subscriptions, you start scrimping and saving, you cut down on anything that was considered a luxury. And then you get by for a number of years. But over that number of years, you don't have enough money to, say, pay a plumber, or the roof starts to go and you don't have enough money to repair the roof on your house. The house is still standing, but over the years it deteriorates. And then you get a job, which is like whoopee-doo. You start to get enough money coming in to cover the day-to-day stuff. So you start to sort of live a bit better each day to day. But just because you've got a job and you've had a job for a couple of months, does that mean that you can repair the roof yet? No, it doesn't. You have to save. You have to save money so that you can slash out 20 grand or whatever it is to buy a roof. And so getting that job and being able to sort of feel a bit better about the day-to-day stuff doesn't take care of all of the debt that you've accumulated over however many years that you haven't had a job, or those people that you have to pay back. And so you need to keep lots of money coming in, I'm afraid, to cover that debt, or to even start to get that debt covered. And so that's how I see nutritional rehabilitation. The whole time that your body has been in energy deficit, especially if you've been an idiot like me, exercising the whole time your body's in malnutrition, your body has so much to repair that you start eating more and you're covering your daily needs maybe, but your body's got these huge debts it needs to pay it off by repairing things. And so more energy, and an energy deficit can go on for a long time after what the scale says nutritional rehabilitation is reached, because your body's still doing internal repairs and it's still paying off that debt that was accumulated.
So then as part of it, you also cover many different effects of malnutrition. And I also find this can be helpful for people to hear, because there can almost be a normalization that symptoms start to happen, and they happen for so long that you often stop thinking them of symptoms. So going through this can be useful for make people realize that these are symptoms. They aren't a normal state of health. So do you want to talk about some of the ones you cover in the book, or if it's easier to remember the symptoms that you went through as part of malnutrition?
Really, the physical symptoms, I think people understand more. I think that the mental symptoms can be a lot more interesting and actually help people who are in that path of, well, maybe I'm not super underweight, so I don't have an eating disorder, or anyone who's trying to convince themselves that they don't have an eating disorder. The more sort of mental state symptoms of malnutrition are often more telling. So for me, one of these was I suddenly became very sensitive to noise and crowds. Basically, I've always been an extrovert as a child, and that really changed the more into malnutrition I went. I think that makes perfect sense. I think that when the body has not got enough energy, it becomes more introverted. And not passing any judgments on people who are introverts, but I think that the brains. I think that another thing with why this is to do with malnutrition is that if your brain thinks that you're in a situation of food scarcity, then you become less social, because your brain's kind of like other people could be a threat to the food source. And so part of me was very lonely, but a part of me was just really happy being quite insular and just keeping to myself. Massive increases in impatience and irritability. I think that a malnourished brain and body has every reason to be impatient and irritable, but I was just awful. I couldn't even stand myself. I was so horrible, vile to everyone, especially, unfortunately, those who were closest to me, like my parents. I think that depression is also another one. As well as, and this is interesting, I noticed, and I only noticed this as I came out the other side, that there had been just a dulling of my senses, such as hearing and my visual senses. As I came through recovery, suddenly the world literally started to feel like it was brighter. Colours seemed brighter, and so that was another thing that I noticed that must have been something to do with malnutrition. I was more paranoid and defensive, which, if you think of a starving animal, they're pretty defensive. I developed a kind of like hoarding habits, hoarding food mostly, but not just food. I would hoard all sorts of things. Anything that I could get for free, I sort of would hoard. I had plastic bags. I used to save plastic bags. Don't even really remember why. I used to save things like plastic cutlery and sachets of salt and anything that I might get. I would just hoard all these things, which makes sense as a malnourished person, or in areas of food scarcity, your brain would come to this place of resources are scarce, so I need to save them. Mental hunger is the huge one for most of us. There's not many people who can deny that they are thinking. They can deny it to other people, but not themselves. The looping, continuous thinking about food is mental hunger. And for many of us, I think that mental hunger and just how boring it is and taunting it is what really drives us to want to recover. Because I was just so sick of my own head. That was a big one for me, was the mental hunger, and that absolutely went away for recovery. I don't sit there and think about food the whole time. Trouble sleeping, I'd say, is a symptom of eating disorders. Things like low sex drive, losing your menstrual cycle if you're a woman, thinning hair, these are all sort of more like physical ones as well.
Yeah.
So the mental ones, though, and some more of those, is this fear of eating too much. I think that's a huge mental one, that most of us just have this idea of how much we should or can eat in a day, and eating anything more than that elicits this fear response. And I think that's because when your brain thinks you need to be migrating, really you should be eating the smallest amount possible for you to survive that day, and not wasting any more time searching for food above and beyond that. To do so is a threat to your survival, and therefore we have this huge fear response about eating more. Many of us find during recovery we can eat more, and that's scary, and then that becomes safe, and then eating more again is scary. So that usually continues throughout recovery. Fear of weight gain. I think that for migrating animals, that sort of weight gain signifies that you're not doing that. If you're in a food scarcity area, you're spending too much time looking for food and eating food in that area, and too little time migrating. So I think that this is why there's this just across the board fear of weight gain, even in people like myself who don't like being underweight and never wanted to lose weight in the first time. I was still terrified of weight gain. Another one was a fear of being still, fear of not moving. It just went beyond anything else. I got to the point where I couldn't really sit down during the day, not willingly at least. I would stand, and it was really, really limiting. I couldn't go places because I was too scared to sit in the car. So that's just, I had this really huge fear of being still. So and there are more, and I go into a lot of these more in the book. But one other one that I'd really like to draw attention to is that eating becomes highly emotional when you're in malnutrition. And whether you have the anorexia genetics or not, if a person's in malnutrition, just eating is still more emotional than it should be. And that's because our brains use the emotions of kind of like lust and desire and wanting. When we're in malnutrition, our brain uses these to try and motivate us to eat. But if you also have that migration response, your brain uses the emotions of fear, disgust, regret, dread, shame to motivate you not to eat, in inverted commas, too much, because you should be migrating. And so if you're still having an emotional response to food, it means you're not out of energy deficit, because it's not normal to hit the wall if someone comes in and offers you a grilled cheese sandwich. That's not a normal reaction to food. And so if you're ever wondering, do I still have an eating disorder? That's what you have to look out for. You have to look out for that emotional reaction to food, because if you have that, that's not normal. And for me, fully recovered, that has completely gone away. Yeah, I like food. Yeah, I eat food. I'm not lusting after it every moment of the day, and mentally at least. And I'm not having a fear reaction or a reaction if someone's threatening me if they come in and offer me food. So I think that one's a really big and important one.
And there was another one that you mentioned as well in the book, which was like difficulty spending money on yourself. And the reason I'm bringing this one up is because I noticed it, and I've had many conversations with clients about this. And so it was then quite telling or really helpful to then read about it in the book and see that this is very much a common part of the illness.
And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because it really does tie in to the whole resource scarcity thing. And really, it was also my inability to spend money and my huge fear reaction at having to spend money that also led me into understanding that this is a biological response. My brain thinks that resources are scarce. And when resources are scarce, I can't go off spending money. I have to save. It's like every day I was saving for an apocalypse or something. I was hoarding stuff, and spending money or giving away resources created huge anxiety for me. And I think that this is one of the things, alongside the exercise is becoming more recognized, but I think that the money spending thing is often really overlooked, that this is an eating disorder thing. And it's also annoyingly one of those traits, just like being somebody who exercises, just like being somebody who likes to eat clean, it's one of those things that's kind of congratulated by our culture. Oh, good, lucky you, you're a saver. Aren't you great? Saving's good. Yes, being frugal is good. For a person with an eating disorder, it's not good. It's part of the eating disorder. It can turn into something that's really a lot bigger than just being a little bit frugal. And so that's something for me. I had to rewire that. I had to, because if I was still acting like money was scarce, my brain would still think that resources are scarce. I had to stop acting as if resources were scarce in order to convince my brain that resources weren't scarce anymore. And that was one of the ways I had to stop acting like resources were scarce. I had to be able to spend money.
And you also talk about different types of restriction that occur. So people are probably aware of restricting calories or restricting certain types of food, so avoiding carbs or, like as you said there, only eating clean. But you go through lots of different options that can also occur. And again, I think it's useful because after a while, these can become the norm and people can forget to recognize that this behavior is a problem. So do you want to go through just some of the other types of restriction that you comment on in the book?
Yeah, and many of them really come about in our sort of like the rules that we all have. Like you said, the obvious is just restricting parts of your diet, but many of us kind of like have these, it's just so much more entwined and in depth than that. Like event restriction is a huge one. So for me, if anything that was going to happen that was going to be outside of my normal day, it didn't have to be something huge. I always use the example of taking the dog to the vet appointment on the afternoon. It would cause me to restrict more that day, to try and create more energy deficit. Any change in my normal routine would cause me to do what I call event restrict, which is like in preparation for an out of the normal event, I need to restrict food or exercise more. The monetary restriction we talked about, that's a huge one. I think that many people who, especially if you're functioning with your eating disorder, you can fly under the radar because you sort of restrict, but it's in a way that's culturally appropriate. Like, oh, I don't eat gluten, or I don't eat these things, or, I'm just healthy eating. And it's all actually really restriction. I think that many of us have also real, what I call timing rules around when we can eat, what we can eat, when, like, the time of day that we can eat, which is a huge form of restriction for many of us. Is like, well, I'm hungry at 11 o'clock, but I don't eat lunch until 1 p.m. And so it's not that I'm not eating lunch. I'm just restricting by not eating lunch, not eating earlier, even though I'm hungry for it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And so let's chat a little bit more about the brain rewiring piece and maybe like what that looks like in real terms. So how does someone go about that?
So it's really as easy and as difficult as detecting what it is that you are resistant to or scared of, and then doing exactly those things until your brain is no longer scared of it. It's just like training an animal. You're training your brain. And the way that you train your brain is you give your brain that experience over and over again until your brain knows that that's safe. So a really obvious one is, I'm scared of pizza. I don't eat pizza for whatever reason. All these things usually fly into your head as reasons why you can't eat pizza. And really all of those reasons are just fluff. It just boils down to fear. I'm scared of the damn pizza. And, so you run towards it rather than away from it. You go and eat pizza. And what I did with things like that, fear foods, I just ate. Consistency is really important, and doing it as often and consecutively as you can. And so I eat pizza every mealtime for a number of days until it was no longer something that my brain thought was different or scary. That's an example of my brain starting to rewire around that thing. Like, oh, my brain has learned because it's experienced. I've given it data to show it that pizza, nothing bad happens after I've eaten it. My brain then learns that that's safe. So that's a really obvious one. But the rewiring stuff is much often less obvious than that. Many of us have sort of like these what I call neural ruts that we get into, which is like, this is the way I do my day. And first of all, like I spoke about the exercise, first of all, I go running and then I eat breakfast and then I do this and then I do that. And just actually changing that day can provoke huge anxiety for many of us. And so it's just detecting where you're rigid. Like the way I made a cup of tea was rigid, and just taking a deep breath and saying, and I'm going to change it. And just blindly going in and going, and I'm just changing it just to prove that I can, because there'll be so much resistance in your brain to actually changing it, all these reasons why you shouldn't do that. And then even the tiniest things, like eating with a teaspoon was something I had to rewire. No, I'm not doing that. I'm eating with normal cutlery. The times that I ate was something that I had to rewire. No, I'm going to eat earlier than that time that I'm not allowed to eat before. And you just attack all of them by actually doing the opposite of exactly what your eating disorder brain wants you to do, and doing it consistently as well. It's if I just done I'm not going to eat with a teaspoon once, then it's really big and scary the first time, and kind of like that you force yourself to not do it. If I'd done it once and then not done that again for a month, it would be just as difficult the next time. You've got to do it really consistently, and like the next time I eat, no, I'm not eating with a teaspoon, I'm not doing this anymore. And then really fast, actually, I find that the brain can then learn that something's safe, and that it's only ever taken me, say, if I'm really consistent, it only ever took me a couple of days really to stop something provoking anxiety type reaction in me.
And so how long did it, for you, and I know you aren't necessarily the norm, but how long did it feel like that neural rewiring process took?
Well, I think I also didn't have any guidance. I didn't really know what I was doing. I certainly didn't have words like neural rewiring. It
Sure.
just felt to me like I have to start challenging these things I'm scared of, and I hate it that I'm scared of these things, and damn it, I'm not going to be scared anymore. I'm going to prove I can do it. So it's really, restriction sort of unfolds the more that you dig into it. There's the really obvious types, and then as you keep going through, it's like, damn it, I'm restricted about this and like this and like that. One of my clients once, she described restriction as like dog crap that you've stepped in and then walked all over your house. It's like, it's everywhere. And that's what most of us come to, like, oh my gosh, it's in everything that I do. And so the quicker you can kind of unravel that and just attack it, the quicker it can happen. But really, we're talking months rather than years to change the behaviors. It doesn't take long to change things, but what it does take a long time to is for those neural pathways to become old and not likely to resurface again. So it's a bit like, say, for example, if you have been in a huge traumatic relationship and one day you make the decision, I'm leaving. And the day that you make that decision, I'm leaving, and you leave, your life's going to be way different and way better, I would hope. But it's probably going to take a couple of years before you can walk down that old street that you used to live in without having emotional or any kind of physical response, without having those neural pathways come back up, without having some trauma come back up or whatever it was. And so that I found that in that first couple of months, I could change a lot. I changed all the behaviors. But it took me a couple of years before I was no longer vulnerable to those neural pathways coming back. It took me a couple of years before I could exercise and it not to become compulsive. It took me a couple of years before I could do a lot of things and not have them trigger my eating disorder. It's like I had to be really vigilant for a couple of years in keeping those neural pathways underneath and not letting them resurface.
Okay. And so, look, my final question or final area that I'd like to focus on is parents in recovery. And I know the stereotype is like typically young, single, female, but many of the clients that I work with, and I imagine that you probably work with as well, are people who are older and do have a family. So is there any, advice or comments that you want to make around this segment when it comes to recovery when you're older and when you're a parent?
Yeah, use whatever help and support you can get, and usually your family are going to be the best source of that. I know that that's not true for absolutely everyone, but for the majority of us, our family are the people that are there with us no matter how vile we've been to them for years, in my case. And they're also the people that are going to call you on your bullshit. And so I think that for most people, it's not actually that you can't use your family to help you support or to help support you. It's that you don't want to, or that there's shame there, or there's embarrassment. There's many other reasons. But I can't urge strongly enough for people not to do what I did, because it took me a long time. My recovery could have been so much faster if I had allowed my family to support me and help me. And I think it's when you're an adult, there's just sort of this stigma around going back home and asking for help. But I've had a number of people who I've worked with as a coach, and the decision that we've come to is no, like one client I had was 45. She went home and stayed with her parents for 3 to 4 months to refeed herself, or to have them help her refeed herself. And that was the best thing she could have done. And it was exactly what she needed to do. And so I'm always, if you have got that situation, if you have got family support, use it. It's just going to make your recovery faster and stronger.
Yeah. And I would definitely agree with that. So, look, Tabitha, this has been great. I thoroughly enjoyed your book and I've loved this conversation. I think there's a wealth of information that people can then use. So before I wrap this up, can you tell people where they can go and find out more information about you? So website, social media, podcast, and I'll put all of that in the show notes.
Sure. I think that the best place is really my website. It's tabithafarrar.com, because the podcasts are on there, and I think linked to YouTube videos and blogs and all those sorts of things. But I'm also on Facebook. It's Tabitha Farrar, and Twitter and Instagram. It's actually under my first book, which was called Love Fat. And so my handle on Twitter is @_love_fat_.
Okay, perfect. Well, yeah, thank you so much for coming on and for chatting with me today.
Oh, it was really fun. Thank you. Thanks for taking the time, and nice, great questions, and just a real pleasure to talk to you, Chris.
Thanks for listening.